Well, the Marine Police Headquarters in Tsui wasn't just offices for the senior staff. It was where the crews actually changed duties. I mean, we went there, got into our uniforms. We had our kit lockers. The armory was there. The stores was there. Our mess was there with a little bar. So without doubt, that was a working police station.
A lovely grass lawn in those days, which ran out to the tower, the signal tower, yeah. So there was room in those days to actually parade your crew, inspect them, march them up and down a bit, shout so that the senior officers inside could hear you were on the job.
At that time, there were very few police stations in the land which had an officer's mess with a bar. So the Mariner's Rest is what it was called, was one of the first.
Yeah, the Mariner's Rest.
Yeah.
That was the social centre for Marine headquarters. And when you joined, every officer was a member of, you always were a member of the mess anyway. But it wasn't a residential mess. All the other stations had residential messes. Because we were on boats, we didn't have a residential mess. So always lunchtimes were in there, but every Friday, if I say every Friday, it might have worked out once every second Friday as time went on, just as numbers dwindled. There would always be a curry lunch on there. There would always be a lunch if your monthly conference was on. And these curries came from, they started off with the Indian constables that were in Tsim Sha Tsui. Then it became the fashion for the sergeants to learn to make these curries.
In those days, the whole compound was a fairly busy place with all these different units involved in one building. And in fact, some of the officers were even out in the old Nissen huts that were out on the lawn in front of the building, as well as the canteen, which was probably one of the main focal points for the whole building.
We left Shanghai sailing for Hong Kong on the President Gordon, which was a troop ship, an American troop ship. And that ship was to take us to Hong Kong, and we were to be transshipped in Hong Kong on the HMS Dun Trun, an Australian warship. And when we arrived in Hong Kong, the ship to Australia had been confiscated by the Australian government to bring home the Australian soldiers who fought in the Pacific. He had organized for us a temporary stay at the Peninsula Hotel. Now, of course, the accommodation for 300 people overnight at the Peninsula Hotel was not feasible. So what happened was they converted the ballroom on the upper floor of the hotel into two areas. One half for women and girls, and the other half for men and boys. We had a Jewish New Year festival coming on. That is a very big day in the Jewish calendar. And they made a certain provision for a room available to us, which we used to conduct our holy services, which we did. And they even provided us with a very festive meal on that New Year's night. At the end of the day, people became restless. They wanted to move on to Australia, to their family, that they started to send us to Australia in small groups on planes. The elderly were moved first, and then the young families with children next, until they gradually emptied out the whole group. I think we had the last lot leaving in December 1946.
We stayed originally on the second floor, and then for a while we were on the sixth floor, 602 and 603 I think our rooms were. I can remember the annual Queen's birthday parades, and they always used to terminate just outside the peninsula, and especially in sort of the 50s and early 60s. They were, because there was a really big British garrison here in Hong Kong, it was really exciting. You know, the Gurkha regiments used to have leopards and things. So it was really incredible. And the Scottish regiment had bagpipes and mass bands, and the parade used to go on for ages. There'd be tanks, and and that's something that's very memorable.
In 1921, the company left Chatham Road and moved to a new power station at Hock Yuen. The new turbine hall was able to produce 1,000 kilowatts of power, 5 times the initial capacity of the old station.
I was called up by the Defence Secretary and told, now you're to go over to Kowloon and give instructions for the power station to be blown up. When I got to Kowloon, I commandeered a small bus and I drove first to the Channel Light offices and continued to the power station. When I got there, I found that the instructions to blow up the turbine had already been given and that Mr. Gavriloff had done this. I proceeded back to the ferry. We managed to get on a steam launch, and that was the last launch to cross.
There were a number of turbines in operation, and the one essential part of the turbine was called a governor, and all the governors were dismantled and thrown into the sea. And the Japanese soon found out about it and fished them out of the sea and pulled them back again and got some of the units to work, not all of them.
I was the first person to be out of Shanghai to get back to Hong Kong, first POW. As the Consul General came in, he had a DC-3 plane, and I managed to get on that plane. We got back as far as Kunming. At Kunming, it was extremely difficult to find any transport to get to Hong Kong, and only at first they absolutely refused to take any passengers whatever, but I at last persuaded them after the Americans had helped me, and I was there by then in a GI uniform, but all that's another story. I managed to get them to take me and bring me to Hong Kong as freight. And I arrived here sitting on a large pile of banknotes which had been flown in from London to get Hong Kong back again onto its normal business background. But the main thing was to get busy again, and without electricity you couldn't get busy. So we started to try and find people who could operate the power station. Fortunately, in the RAF, there was a power station engineer, not our engineer, Newman, and he got the place going at first. Then slowly our own engineers came back from camp.
My father was a marine engineer, and he was offered a job for the Hong Kong Whampoa Dock Company Limited. So he came out ahead of the rest of the family in 1959. Then the family followed afterwards. We lived inside the dockyard. The dockyard had some lovely colonial style houses which were terraced houses, and we had lots of areas for playing. There was swing parks and tennis courts, and there was a beach right down from the dockyard as well, so we could go and swim in the beach. The dockyard itself was in a walled compound by the time we'd arrived, although earlier it was just an open plan type of scenario, but I think there was some security concerns in the 1930s and also after the Second World War, so they walled it in. And but beyond the wall was the village and subsequently town of Hong Hum, and there were many artisans there, and people lived there because they worked in the shipyard. It was full of squatter huts, people who had been refugees that arrived in Hong Kong, working in the factories, working in the dockyards, who would go out, and there were the kids. And we were forbidden to play with the kids. in the street outside the dockyard. And likewise down on the beach. I'm sure there was some bogus excuse that these kids have got disease or something, but it was a racially prejudiced thing. So we didn't really have much interaction with the kids. Occasionally you'd look through the fence and you'd get a dialogue going with someone and you'd erupt into swearing and this, that and the other. And we would also fly kites, and you would have these fights across the Dyer Avenue. You'd fight with the kites and try and cut someone else's. And of course they were far more adept at flying kites. And in fact we would go down to the market and buy a kite. It was ready-made, and buy the reels and the string and everything. They'd make their own out of old newspaper, and they could fly an old newspaper and it would fly rings around our custom-made kite. And so that was one of the interactions.